Welcome to the Death Science Podcast, where we explore new perspectives on life, death, dying, and the dead. You can find the audio on all major podcast platforms by searching Death Science Podcast, and you can find the video on YouTube at www.deathscience.tv. You can learn more about the show at deathscience.org. Welcome to episode number 13. Today's guest is Cassandra Kuba, a forensic anthropology professor at California University in Pennsylvania. We'll be talking about stuff like career path options for people interested in pursuing forensic science. Also, how exactly TV crime shows misrepresent investigations in forensics. What can one expect when working with the dead and decaying? Also, why forensic research facilities, also known as body farms, are so important and needed. And we talk about so much more. But before we get started, I want to talk about catacombculture.com. This is where I sell my sculptures. My sculptures being functional home decor I make out of hyper-realistic human bones. From human bone lamps to food-safe skull bowls, I make a lot of memento mori-friendly pieces that serve as reminders that our lifespans are limited. So let's make the best out of the time we have left. You could explore my bone gallery at catacombculture.com. Also, restinggrounds.org will guide you in exploring alternative post-life care for your deceased body. Your deceased body has the potential to literally save lives, advance multiple fields of science, and so much more. Learn more at restinggrounds.org. Now let's meet Cassandra and explore new perspectives on life, death, dying, and the dead. On this episode of Death Science Podcast, we are joined by Cassandra Kuba, who is a professor of anthropology at the California University in Pennsylvania. Hey, Cassandra, how are you today?
I'm good, and yourself?
Good. So tell us a little bit about forensic anthropology. What is that?
So forensic anthropology is a field of study that combines both archaeology and biological anthropology to help in death investigations. So we can assist with the search, recovery, and analysis of human remains, usually in a decomposed state, to help figure out who the person was, how long they've been deceased, and what had happened to them.
When I think of archaeology, for some reason I think, what's it, Indiana Jones. Now, is that just a Hollywood kind of fictional character, or is that kind of like what's modern day archaeology look like?
Nothing like Indiana Jones. He's more reminiscent of 19th century antiquarians who would loot sites under the guise of learning about past cultures with little respect for those cultures per se. But archaeology is still very fascinating. So one of the other things that I do is bioarchaeology, and that's essentially doing the forensics of the past. And so that excitement of discovering something that hasn't been seen for centuries, or learning little tidbits about a person's life that hadn't been recorded in the history books. That's very exciting, but it's also many tedious hours working in all sorts of conditions, or many hours bent over in the lab analyzing whatever it is that you found. So fame and glory it is not, but it's extremely fascinating.
I feel like, are there any new archaeology sites that may have been, made current headlines or anything like that?
Well, my news feeds are always a bit biased because outside of the US, I've done a lot of work in England. So I get a lot of British news feeds on like new hoards that have been discovered or new facets about a site that's been found, with a lot of people being shut in. There was an online course, if you will, of students, faculty, and general public viewing over Lidar images. So that's laser scans of the landscape and finding new sites. Like there was a new hill fort, I think it was in Scotland, that was discovered that way. Or like for this, I'm a nerd. So for fun, I like to pick random locations on Google Maps and look for signs of human activity that might still be evident in those satellite images. That's one of the things I do for fun. So there's been a lot of that. That people have been doing, and helping to locate places that once things settle down, if they're able to go out and about again, for them to explore. My dissertation chair, Dr. Brenda Baker at Arizona State University, she has done a lot of work in Sudan, and a lot of her preliminary research was making use of satellite images to help pinpoint locations for them to check out when they were over there for the field season. So it's a very legitimate way of getting a feel for what's out there without having to be on the ground right away. And so that's one of the things that you can do during this, downtime, if you will.
Nice. Do you have any tips as to find these like really good like random points around the world?
So if you're not using LIDAR, which is able to like sort of ignore the vegetation, looking at places that don't have a lot of trees helps. So, like the desert locations, or I've been looking a lot out west, or where there's a lot of grassland, because you can get crop marks. If there are, say, stone structures underneath the ground, it interrupts the roots. And so that can affect how the vegetation is growing. That's something that we use to look for buried bodies. And so that's something that I'll go for, is to, places without lots of trees, so that you have a chance to see the ground surface.
Nice. Yeah, I see. For all my TikTok friends listening or watching, on TikTok there's this app called Randonautica. Have you heard of it?
Oh, I heard, because there were some teenagers that found a dead body in a suitcase.
Yes. Yeah, so that app has swept TikTok for sure, and intrigued a lot of curious adventurers. And so I know a lot of people would appreciate to was it Lidar Technology you said? Yeah.
Yep. So LIDAR. It's really interesting. They found, say, like in Central and South America, that they've identified roadways and pyramids they didn't know were there because they've been so covered by the vegetation. Or other sites in like Southeast Asia, again, where the vegetation might be too heavy that you're not going to see it when you're on the ground. And you can attach LiDAR devices to drones now. Before they used to have to use helicopters and airplanes, but now they have smaller units that you can mount to drones to look in a specific area. So it's really cool what they're able to do with that technology.
Now, have you heard any fun conspiracy theories that you might be able to debunk for us as far as archaeology goes?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. I hadn't thought about conspiracy theories. I mean, people will often ask me if hair and nails continue to grow after a body, after a person has died, and they seem so saddened when I tell them no, they don't. It's just the skin shrinking and making them appear like they're longer. Let's burst that bubble. But then they can go in turn burst somebody else's bubble by sharing that information. But off the top of my head, I can't think of any.
So one thing I like to do is create videos that make people think, right? And I came across this one collection of videos about giant human bones, that there was a race of giants that roamed. What do you think?
One of my professors, when I was working on my doctorate, actually analyzed some of those remains, and I think the individuals tended to be taller than the average Peruvian, but not on the scale of like someone who's 7.5, 8 feet tall or anything like that. But they were, if memory serves, taller than average for that area.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I've seen some things where people like, they were 12 to 15 feet tall and they were cannibals and all that. So I'm like, oh my God.
Or there was one that was fetal remains, but they were claiming that it was an alien because the head was so misshapen and it looked so weird that they felt it had to be alien. And yeah, I've seen that a few years ago. I'm like, no, that's just someone who was not full term. That's fetal skeletons look really weird. Even newborn skeletons look really weird. So it's just normal variation. That's one of the things that's important for us, any of us who are working with skeletal remains, to have an appreciation for the range of human variation. and to know what's normal, what's not normal. And if you only work on one population, anything that looks different from that one population, you're going to think is abnormal, pathological, it has to be alien or just something other. And
Right.
it's really not, that's just variation. And it's one of the important things for us to have a lot of collections to work with in order to be able to appreciate that range of variation.
Another, I don't know if it's conspiracy theory, but what was that lost city of Atlantis?
Mm.
Is that real, or is that just kind of like mythical? What do you think?
Um, well, I mean, there's definitely been cities lost to rising sea waters for sure, or have fallen off into the ocean due to earthquakes or what have you. But I think um, there's always like a kernel of truth to things, but whether or not it's a full blown city of Atlantis, I don't quite buy myself. But there's definitely evidence of, structures and monuments that have now been covered by the oceans that could have fueled.
So we mentioned was Indiana Jones being a mythical portrayal of the archaeologist. So when it comes to TV shows like, say, CSI or Bones or more forensic anthropology and forensic crime scene investigation, how far fetched are those shows?
I've advised for a lot of shows, so I know where their heart is at and the types of questions that they're asking. But then I also know they've got to make things look good for television. And so, again, kind of like with the idea of Atlantis, there's a kernel of truth, but they have to speed things up. They also make it look a lot easier than it is. There's been times that I had been asked questions for Bones that I would write them a huge response to give them all like the scientific background on something, and then it's just like on the screen and it's gone, and that was all that for just like zero point 0.5 seconds of television. But they tried. CSI really kind of started that push to try to be as realistic as possible within the world of Hollywood, and working still with that realism on Bones. And have there been many other shows that have gone as far? I mean, in pulling in the outside researchers to help consult on the shows. They might have an intern or assistant who pokes around a little bit. A lot of shows will do that, but CSI pushed really hard to have real world experts advising. Most of us were not credited. I'd get swag every now and then, but for me, it was a good exercise. And still, when I get questions, sometimes they'll be so far from left field where I'll be like, where in the, what? But then I'll start thinking about, okay, where is the science? How can we make this seem more accurate? And find out areas where there's more research that needs to be done. And so I'd often encourage my students to consider doing research papers or projects on things that might have been initially stimulated by these shows, to say, let's see where this goes, or what else can we do with this? Because Bones was always really interested in getting toxicological results from decomposed remains. And unless it's a heavy metal that was taken up by the bone or the hair or the nails, and they're decomposed, we're not going to have much to test for toxicology. And so trying to see, what else can we propose to them to consider, whether it's something in the burial environment to make something preserve a little better than it normally would. It gets your creative juices flowing. And that's one of the things I love, besides being grounded in science, is still getting to use my imagination and creativity. And so at first I wasn't too keen on helping with the shows because I'm like, oh, they're so over the top. My mom loved CSI, and I just got their puns. It's just, it's painful to watch. But I started to see the opportunity to help them be more accurate, and then also to help get my students involved. And the fact that for many of my students, that was their first introduction to forensic sciences in general. Or with Bones, that so many students will tell me, Oh, I first got interested in learning about the skeleton from bones. And I'm like, oh, really? When it was still on, I was like, you can actually help advise for the show. How would you like to do that? And so always trying to find that positive spin, but it's been fun. Lately, there hasn't been as much push for the forensic science stuff. Been doing a lot of research on other things because they've learned I'm a good researcher and I love to learn. So they throw almost any question at me, and I'll see what I can find out. And if I don't know the answer, I probably know someone who does, and I'll get them in touch with them, and then I'll be curious to see what they say. I'm an eternal student, so any opportunity to learn something new, I look forward to it.
Awesome. So, yeah, same. With the content that I post, I receive a lot of messages and inquiries asking me, an individual is inspired by, say, CSI or Bones, and then they come to me and it's like, hey, how do I get started to get onto that crime scene? And I'm like, ooh, that's a really good question. So what's your advice for individuals who are very passionate to learn more about forensics and actually want to pursue that as a career? What kind of path is in store for them?
Well, it'll depend on the nature of what exactly they want to do. So if they want to be like a crime scene technician and really just helping with gathering the evidence in the field versus being more lab-based, that oftentimes the archaeology comes really in handy for the crime scene element for the mapping purposes. But if they see themselves wanting to work more with the evidence and analyzing, probably biology and chemistry right now are the biggest things to go for. I'll tell my students, like, pay attention to the American Academy of Forensic Sciences website. It's aafs.org. Look at the employment opportunities, see what credentials they're looking for, and it's usually biology, chemistry, or related field. And generally, once you're trained in at least some of the basics of laboratory analysis, if the crime lab needs you to be trained to do something else, then they'll usually train you, to do, say, ballistics analysis or blood spatter analysis. But the main thing is the biology and the chemistry, because they need a lot of toxicologists and they need a lot of folks to analyze DNA samples. And so those are the two big areas. When students are interested in the skeleton, but they want to do more with less decomposed remains, I've encouraged students to consider forensic pathology. But for that, you need to go on to med school first and then get additional training in the pathology. And I was daunted by the idea of going to med school and having to treat living people first, as you're doing your clinical rotations. That I did not want that responsibility. I just wanted to stick with the already dead people. And so that wasn't a path for me. But one of my students was recently accepted into medical school. She's going to go on for the forensic pathology track. So she kept the anthropology major and she minored in biology because forensic pathologists have to wear many hats. They have to have some grounding in the chemistry, and they have to do a lot of dissection. And they get a little bit into the skeletal analysis, but just a smidgen. And so with what she had worked on, she'll have a lot more of that skeletal experience behind her. So when she gets a position one day, she'll be better qualified than many to do analysis of the decomposed remains herself.
How about the career path for a forensic anthropologist that wants to be in the field and help catch those bad guys?
So forensic anthropology is one of those disciplines where a bachelor's alone is not going to cut it. Now, you could potentially get in, say, with the FBI on one of their crime scene response teams, where you'll be more experienced in doing archaeological excavation and being able to tell that's not human in some of the basics, but you won't be qualified to do the analysis itself. You'd be a well-trained helper, but essentially in our discipline, they're expecting that doctorate. So between bachelor's, master's, PhD, it took me 12 years. And some programs are doing away with the master's. So one of my students just started at Arizona State my alma mater, I went in there just for the doctorate. I had already had a master's. She just got her bachelor's. She's already in the doctoral program. So she has the potential of getting completed a few years ahead than I was. How old was I when I graduated from there? What, 30? Yeah, I think it was 30 by the time I graduated with that. No, 31, 31. So that's a long time to be in school. I scare my son when I tell him I've been in school, you know, since 1980. And he's like, what? It's like, it's a lot. I like to learn. What can I say?
Yeah.
But it's a long time to be really poor though. You're a poor graduate student. So I'll let my current students know, like, I've been there. I've lived on the sniff the milk. How long can we stretch that out? Because I can't afford to buy any more milk. It's like, I've been there, and persistence and patience, eventually you'll get there. It can be a long road. I didn't really earn a decent paycheck until I was like 32. So it's a long time. Carry a lot of debt with you. So still have that riding over me.
So when it comes to like lab work, lab analysis, we're looking at biology and chemistry as like majors.
Things right now, because you can get in as long as you're seeking out as many opportunities as possible to get extra experience, not just counting on the coursework, but going that extra mile, getting involved in independent research with your faculty. If you're qualified to get in with the honors program and seek out additional work for more hours in the lab, anytime you can volunteer to help out your faculty, that's going to be crucial. So, because one of the hardest things is I just got my bachelor's degree, but I can't apply for any entry-level positions because they want 2 years of experience. How do I just graduated? I can't get the experience without getting the job. And so all that volunteer work and internships are crucial. The students who really, really bust their butts in doing all that extra work, it's a juggle. One of my majors a few years ago, she was a dual major, anthropology and criminal justice, forensic science combo. She had a fantastic internship with one of the local county coroners, and she always looked for what else could she help them with. And shortly after graduating, she was successful in a competitive job search for a deputy coroner position. She did that for a little over a year. She's now out in San Francisco as a certified death investigator because she wanted something a bit spicier than what she was getting in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So she's out there in San Francisco, and she worked her butt off. If you're just going to class, skimming the surface, just doing what you need to do to pass, eventually that's going to catch up with you. And so it's like you've got to find that balance of dedication to your coursework. Doesn't have to be straight A's. Finding some leadership positions, things to volunteer with and get involved in. That's where you're going to be getting all that extra experience that you can speak about when you go for those job searches, and have someone see that potential in you and be willing to say, you know what, might not have as much experience as, say, this candidate, but I see the fire in that person. I'm going to go with them. They're trainable. They got that fire, that passion, that desire. Let's see what we can do and how we can all work towards a success going forward. So some students are very receptive to that advice, but it's tough because we all want to have some downtime, but you've got to find how to have a little bit of downtime for the stress relief, but then also make the most out of every minute that you can.
What kind of major would that be considered for the lab analysis?
So a lot of places, again, if you just take your basic biology courses, most schools will have a lot of lab analysis associated with that. Like most classes will have a lab component to it. Or for chemistry, definitely, like pretty much every class is going to have a lab component. Now, for me, I don't have separate labs, but most of my courses, I work in that hands-on experience. And then I'm always looking for projects that we can do to help with the community that I can get my students involved in so that they're doing a lot more. analysis.
Okay. So it's more of like, okay, I'm going to register for biology as a major and then apply to jobs in forensic labs?
Yeah, because it's easy enough to take a few, say, an intro to criminal justice or an intro to forensic science course, maybe like a law and evidence course, so that you get some of that understanding, like Fry and Dobert and the rules of evidence and what techniques you can use and why we have to be particular. But that's also something that they can also train you on. Now, some graduate programs will focus on the forensics. So like I had a chemistry major who was an anthro minor. She's now pursuing forensic chemistry for her master's. But a lot of places won't require that forensic element for you to get into the crime lab, because they can always teach you, this is the protocol we follow. As long as you know how to do the lab analysis, how to run that machine, we'll teach you how this all operates within that forensic sphere.
And then for people who want to focus more on pathology, you're saying that's more of a medical school element?
Yeah. So to become a board certified forensic pathologist, it's going to require med school. So that's what, 5 years of general med school training. And then I think it's a 2-year specialty for the pathology piece. So all doctors go through the same basic like med school element. And then if you're going to become an OBGYN or an ENT, then you'll go on for your specialized training to focus on that particular part of the body you want to focus on. But yeah, that med school element, I'm like, I don't want to treat patients. I just want to deal with the dead ones. Not so I chose not to pursue that route, because I didn't want that responsibility of the living people and me having to make the choices for them. Other people, more power to them, because they can. And so yeah, for the pathology piece, getting a lot of dissection experience, anatomy and physiology in undergrad. They needed a lot of chemistry and physics, to prepare themselves for the MCAT exam. But a lot of med schools anymore seem to get away from doing actual human dissections, and that to me is kind of scary. Don't want my surgeon to, look at me for the first first real fleshy body that you're interacting with and cutting open. It's a little scary. I've done a lot of dissection work myself in my years, but the idea of trying to just use models or the virtual cadavers and that be my only training, that kind of scares me. You can't be afraid of touching the dead. That's the first step for my students. Like in my forensic anthropology class, I'll make the offer available to them to go to the anatomy lab on campus. Even for the folks thinking law enforcement, I was like, or being an EMT, I'm like, you're going to see far more nasty accident scenes than I will deal with nasty decomposed bodies. If you can't handle seeing a cadaver in a pretty sterile environment, what makes you think you're going to be able to walk up to that multi-vehicle accident and process that crime scene or that accident scene? And so that's the first test for them, to see if they can step foot in that lab, to see it, and then to actually put a gloved hand, on that individual. And invariably there's always a cadaver that's flipped over, and I'll ask someone, hey, can you give me a hand to flip it over, this body over, so that students can see what's going on with this individual, and to see who's willing to step forward to help me flip that body over. It's always interesting. It's oftentimes the military veterans who are like, yep, I'm here, I'm helping, because they don't want to see me struggle with the whole body by myself. And to see that moment on people's faces, because I have to keep an eye on them to make sure no one's going to pass out on me. And luckily no one has. The closest anyone had was this like 6'2" big burly football player, and I was not going to be catching him. I got a chair under his butt. I told him, take a moment, then we'll get you out of here, because he didn't last 5 minutes. But that's my biggest fear of, okay, let me open this up and just that look on the face, because it's surreal. I mean, I remember for myself, when I had gross anatomy, I'd already been working on forensic cases and processing decomposed human remains, and I figured I'm not going to have any problems with gross anatomy. Like, I've dealt with worse. But that first day when you got to make your first cut, and we were all forensic anthro students working on this particular cadaver, and we kept passing around the scalpel like it was a hot potato. None of us wanted to make that first cut. We're like, you do it. You do it. We finally, all the females ganged up on the one guy and said, here, Paul, you do it. But then, as the semester went on, just using our fingers to remove tissue and whatnot, and you're like, whatever, we get through it. But for us dealing with what we do, so much of forensic anthropology is disgusting. But we can't lose sight of the fact that this is a person who has loved ones wondering what happened. So even though we've got to do some very bizarre things as a means of our recovery and processing of the body and analysis of the bones, we can't lose sight of the fact that, this is John Doe, Don Henry, whoever this person would be, because we'll often, either know whom we're working on at the time we're working on them, or we'll find out shortly thereafter. It's like, have to do what we can to help the community and the families find closure, and if a crime had been committed, to help the police in sealing that case, and if it has to go to trial, and doing whatever we can to help seek justice for that individual. And so it's a tough balance, because a lot of what we deal with is nasty, whether it's part of our training and dealing with the gross anatomy and making the connection that your dissection skills have made you more adept in the kitchen. That's a scary connection to make when you're filleting your chicken. That it's such a mental assault and just an overall sensory assault. And then just knowing how horrible people can be to each other. It takes a bit of strength to that, and to be able to come out on the other side and still be okay. It's a tough adjustment. So letting my students know, it's like, I struggled with my first few cases. I worked on my first case as a sophomore in college, and we got that case on a Monday, and we were out in the field. That Wednesday, we had another case with 3 bodies. So I had 4 bodies after never having done this at all in 1 week. And the second case involved children as well. And that was tough. And so, we spent a lot of time talking about mental health. And in our society today, that's a topic that needs to be more widely discussed anyway, and letting students know that if you're struggling, you're not the only one who is struggling, and we've been there too. And being able to find how to talk about it and then work through the situations that we're dealing with. And in this line of work, you're going to be dealing with a lot of horrid things that people either have done to themselves or someone else has done to them, and being able to come out through it being okay at the end of the day.
What kind of jobs can pathologists anticipate once they leave school?
Well, right now there's a definite need for pathologists, so that's good. But working either with a hospital or with a crime lab, and sometimes those crime labs might be affiliated with the police of the area, or it might be affiliated with a medical examiner's office. Or when I was going to school up in Erie, multiple counties put together to be able to pay for a forensic pathologist, because they're not cheap. So it could be almost anywhere in the country, or if you want to do international work as well, if you're interested in helping with investigations of atrocities, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Because we think of like Physicians Without Borders as only helping the living, but they also help with recovery of the dead and identification of the victims and figuring out what had happened and collecting evidence if it's something that has to go to like an international criminal court. So there's a lot of opportunities there, and that's also with the forensic anthropology as well, helping out with them. So it's really, where do you want to go with it. You can probably find a path there. It's a matter of what are you comfortable with doing. But there's a lot of opportunities out there. Got to work yourself up the ranks, and also consider if you want to deal with the politics, say like in a medical examiner's office. So here for Southwestern PA, Allegheny County has an ME, and that's an appointment. So if the county commissioner doesn't like you, you're out of there. Or if there's a new one voted in and there might be turnover. So there's that element that not everyone's always keen on. Or even just doing private work. So you can make your services available. Not every county has a pathologist, and so they need to contract that work out. And so you could potentially be able to be like a private entity doing consulting work as needed for whomever might need assistance for autopsies.
Yeah, just assuming after watching, say, like CSI, for example, I assume every county, every city has their own CSI team. So is that not true?
No, because it's expensive. So, just like not all towns have their own police anymore. We put a large burden on the Pennsylvania State Police here in PA that, they're providing a lot of the general policing duties. And so we have a lot of regional crime scene offices. So I think what our closest one for processing a lot of the evidence is in Greensburg. And so that's another opportunity for you to do forensic work. They have a lot of internship and trainee positions, just to throw that out there. But yeah, like Washington County, we have a coroner here. That's an elected position, and he's a funeral home director. So he's not qualified to do autopsies. So he contracts that work out. But then the coroner's offices will have detectives associated with them, but they're still making use of whichever jurisdiction had the deceased initially to help with collecting the evidence. Medical examiner's office in Allegheny County, they have death investigators and a very well kitted out crime lab. Carl Williams up there has worked very hard on getting grant money to have a really solid lab up there. But if you're in a more rural area that might not see a lot of deaths, then you might have to send to like the state capital, if you will, to see whatever agencies that work there. We're a blend of coroner medical examiners here in Pennsylvania. Some states, I want to say West Virginia has like a statewide medical examiner's office. So it can really vary who's going to be doing that work. But that's why the FBI gets a lot of requests for assistance too, or jurisdictions that need assistance for that forensic science element, they might request help from the FBI to assist there as well.
So tell us about the difference between a coroner and a medical examiner.
So medical examiners, there'll be some variation because some it's just like an office manager. But in many places, the medical examiner will be an appointed position, and they're often a forensic pathologist. And they'll be overseeing cause and manner of death determinations. And they have claim of the dead and will decide if an autopsy is warranted. So a lot more training. Typically, again, some of the offices are set up where they're more like a manager, but most of them will be pathologists. And coroners are elected positions, oftentimes funeral home directors, because they're used to dealing with dead bodies. Most people don't want to. And oftentimes, once you get that position, it's usually yours until you don't want it anymore. Very rarely will you have opposition. Like it was pretty scandalous that like the Greene County coroner got voted out a few years ago. There's a new guy in there. And then oftentimes it'll run in the family because just like the funeral homes tend to be inherited. Well, the coroner position, like in Somerset County, I had worked on a case with the father way back when, and now like his son's the county coroner. And so you don't have to have any special qualifications other than getting on the ballot and getting voted in. And then they have requirements for education. So you go to a lot of workshops because they also have the power to determine cause and manner of death. but they will have to rely on others to help them in putting all those pieces together in order to make that determination. So that's why there's been a bit more of a push wherever possible to have more medical examiners, because there is more of that education requirement. But then that also means they get paid more, and so usually it's affiliated with larger cities, or some places have gone statewide.
So medical examiner, you have to go to school for, essentially, right? Pathology. But the coroner, just move into a small town and have some friends vote for you, right? Is that?
Yeah, like if you wanted to be a county coroner for your county, just get your campaign together and make that push, get on the ballot, and you conceivably could. That's why I tell my students, I'm like, any of you could be coroner. It's just a matter of being elected. But that can be difficult, a challenge to do, but it can be done.
So you mentioned the FBI before. Have you ever worked with, say, the State Bureau of Investigations?
No, generally for what I've personally been working on, I've worked with Allegheny County on a case, and I've consulted for Fayette County on some cases. I've provided some advice to the state police on cold cases when they're re-examining it and saying, what developments have occurred in forensic anthropology that might help us solve this case from the 1960s, for example. And I was pretty excited because my dad was a state trooper, and so he told me, he shared a newsletter once. He said, hey, look, here's a case that they used a forensic anthropologist and did some forensic DNA stuff. I'm like, yeah, I advised them on that case, and they outsourced it. I'm like, that's fine. What she was able to do is not what I'm able to do. But it was nice to see my advice was able to help them find someone who could help them even more to find some resolution in that cold case. And it was a case my dad said he had recalled when he was first starting out as a trooper back in the late 60s. So that was pretty cool to see.
From your perspective, being and studying in the field for so many years, have you noticed any maybe crime trends, or like crimes that have gone out of style or crimes that have come into style?
Well, people are getting craftier, I think. Still making mistakes, but thankfully, because we want them to be caught. But that they are more aware of how identifications are made, and so they try a bit harder to make it more difficult for forensic scientists to be able to put all the pieces back together and catch them in the end. It's amazing to see how far the science has gotten, or the technology, or it often comes down to, this sounds awful. So I always tell my students, like, if you're going to bump somebody off, you got to keep it to yourself. Criminals always seem to need to tell somebody else about what they've done. So there's still human error comes into play. But they've been trying harder, which means that we have to try harder to find new ways. So I know that you and many of your followers are interested in like alternative burial strategies, and so like alkaline hydrolysis,
Yep.
and more the chemical cremation technique was something I first learned about 2 years ago, thanks to a mortuary sciences student who took my death and dying class. And I hadn't heard of it before, and so it got me thinking, like, what ramifications could this have in forensic anthropology, since they're chemical reagents that you can get a hold of yourself as a regular citizen. So I'm thinking, trying to dispose of bodies, and my chemistry major looked into this for her honors thesis, and so she processed pig femurs, doing the alkaline hydrolysis, because I was like, okay, what does it look like when it comes out after the treatment? What would I still be able to say about the individual? Because fire cremations, professionals, once they grind them up in the retort, you get fragments. But if it's somebody burning their ex-wife in the backyard, we're still going to be able to analyze stuff. And so I'll never forget the day she came in with one of her femurs, and she's like, watch this. and she was able to crush it with her hands. I was like, oh my God, that there's still potential for what we can analyze there. And so I'm thinking, okay, if you're trying, like our next experiment that we need to do is just doing it under regular pressure wherever you are in the world, in a barrel in the basement versus in a pressure cooker, to help speed up the process. So that's my next thing. I need to find another chemistry major who's willing to take that experiment a bit further, because we need to think of, okay, how can this implicate anybody? But how is this going to challenge our ability to figure out what had happened as the end product of the alkaline hydrolysis? So people get craftier, but there's always idiots out there who are going to leave a very messy trail. I will always pay attention to the news about missing persons and thinking about, okay, where should they be looking for these bodies? And I just think of that couple and those two kids, that Vallow lady, and when people started questioning, like, where are the children? I'm like, they're gone, and where are they? And them ultimately finding them on the property. Always have, it feels horrible, always trying to question, like, what are people up to and where are they likely to stash bodies, or what they're likely to do to bodies. No, I guess perhaps we haven't heard about as many serial killers doing really nasty things to bodies lately. Haven't heard a lot about them. So either they've gotten really good and we haven't been connecting the dots, or there haven't been as many. That's one of the things I wonder about, because we don't have as many of those flashy, or we just that better that forensic scientists are helping the police to catch them sooner.
Yeah.
Before they've racked up the body count. So that's been something. Every now and then you'll hear somebody who's had more than a few bodies. Or there was the guy up in Toronto who was depositing body parts in planters around town because he was a landscaper. and I thought, oh, they're gonna have a hard time catching this person. But they did. They managed to catch him. And I think it was because one of his potential victims got away. But he was scattering body parts wherever he was doing his landscaping work, and like that, smart-ish, but yeah, and you don't usually think of that up north. Canadians are so friendly. I'm like, there's crazy people everywhere. But yeah, we haven't had as many serial killers.
Well, there's that one guy. He was like, what, killing people with a hatchet or a machete or something? I think he started in, I want to say, Connecticut, and then he came down to Pennsylvania. He was kind of close to me. He must have been, he was reported to have stolen a car or something, maybe like 45 minutes away. And then he took that car and police still couldn't find him, still couldn't track him. And then they ended up finding him after killing probably upwards of like 10 people, I believe. They found him in Maryland and they got him. I'm like, oh, jeez.
Oh, was that guy in his early 20s?
Yeah, he was a young kid, yeah.
Yeah, and he just went off and went on a spree.
Yep.
But nobody like Hannibal Lecter.
Oh, yeah, those are, they wised up with all these TV shows, I guess. I don't know.
I know, because people are like, oh, we're training them to be better killers. I'm like, with what glimpses they're seeing on TV. I mean, there was one guy who, I want to say it was in the state of Florida. He killed his wife, and like her job, she was an attractive lady, and she would be hired out for events like you could eat sushi off her body.
Ah, okay.
And, as you do. And he killed her, and he pulled out her teeth, chopped off her hands, and figured he'd be good to go.
Oh.
Yeah, because fingerprints, teeth, primary ways that we figure ID. He forgot her breasts were fake, and the implants have serial numbers on them. So they had an easy time figuring out it was her because of her implants. So there's always something. There's always something we can use. I tell my husband, it's like, I'm a bit of a klutz, so I've had a lot of X-rays, CAT scans. So I said, well, no, I've got enough little weird quirks in my body. I'm like, you can use that for identification. Just remember, I have these, or my frontal sinus pattern, or my first bone in my neck. It never formed the whole way. I'm like, that's a quirk.
Oh.
I pointed that out to my doctor, and he's like, what? I was like, look, it's an incomplete posterior neural arch on my atlas. And he's like, what? Like, I would have scored myself for my dissertation, because I looked at those little quirks for my dissertation. I'm like, I would have scored myself. But yeah, there's always something, and always trying to find something new that we can use, or how far DNA analysis has come. The like trace DNA, that you just barely touch something from your fingerprints, that they might have something that they can salvage for identification. It's just amazing to think of that it's come that far. I did DNA analysis for my master's thesis, and that was 20 years ago. It's scary to think it's been that long, but I just think of what I was capable of doing then. Wasn't a whole lot looking at nuclear DNA from archaeological bone, to see what they can do now. It's just astounding. Or the different ways that we can utilize the technology with drones and things like that to help with detecting graves. So like one of the techniques, I've been hoping we can get one of these setups at my school, that infrared cameras, because graves will heat up and then cool off at different rates compared to undisturbed soil. So we could use that to help detect graves, as well as features at archaeological sites. There's other applications for that as well. And but just to think of how we can use that, rather than just walking on the ground and looking for some sort of indication that there's a body here, because buried bodies are not always easy to find. And if we can use the technology to help us, and to have a drone that you can just pop up there really quick and get immediate results, that'll help speed things up so much more quickly, that bodies are less likely to go undetected.
What would you say are the most common traits that forensic anthropologists look for? It's what, the, like you mentioned before, the fingertips, maybe some dental records, but you also mentioned what, like little unique bone quirks and stuff, and
So
maybe even like tattoos and stuff like that.
if they preserve, you can definitely, in a sense, a lot of people have tattoos now, and very individualizing tattoos that, they won't themselves necessarily be conclusive to identify someone, but at least says, well, it's consistent, so we're on the right path. Because you could always try to mimic somebody's artwork, but it's a way of having a probable match to know that you're on the right path for that. So when we're dealing with mummified tissue, you can potentially rehydrate fingertips for them to be able to roll them for prints. Or if it's in the earlier stages of decomposition and the skin's starting to slip off, the epidermis will slip off, that it can peel off like a glove. And one of my friends, because her hand was smaller, had to slip it on so that they could roll it for prints. I prefer more advanced decomp, because I'm like, oh, that's gross. But really, when we're called in, oftentimes I feel like I'm sort of the middleman, because I'll say, ooh, we need to make sure, you need a forensic botanist, because they can look at those roots that are growing through the skeleton and estimate, how quickly does that plant grow? How long has that plant been growing through our bones? They can help give you a time frame. Or to call in the entomologists to help out with analyzing the insects. Because the bugs are good for more than just figuring out how long the body's been there. And when it comes down to just looking at the bones themselves, obviously we're going to want to look for features that we can use for more positive identification. And typically the teeth will be the main thing. A forensic dentist will be called in to make that final call, but depending on the case, we had one in the state of Indiana where it was a serial killer site, actually. And the guy had tried covering up everything, burying, he burned, and then he drained his pool to flush stuff everywhere. And they had to recover everything, and then trying to sort out those teeth to figure out how many individuals are represented, and then to help the dentist be ready to go in to make his ID, because dentists aren't used to just having a pile of teeth. That's one of the things I like working on. I have over 800 teeth sitting in this room with me right now, all
Nice.
loose, and trying to sort those out into which particular tooth is it, and could they belong to the same individual, because it's so much quicker to make a dental ID than waiting for the DNA to confirm. And if, say we don't have dental records to run with, but maybe some other type of medical imaging was done, then being able to match up some unique structures within the skeletal anatomy to help with the identification process. So one of the prime areas that we can use is the frontal sinus right up in here. It is pretty individualizing. Right now, it's pretty much comparable to what we can do for fingerprints, but most people haven't had their heads x-rayed as much as they might need it. And so if we don't have an ante-mortem image, or one while the person was alive, to compare with our dead one, then it's not going to matter. But it's not everybody has as many lobes on it. Some people, they extend up really far or wide. Mine are puny. For as many sinus headaches as I get, I thought I was going to have massive ones, and they're really small. So that was not fun. I was disappointed in myself. But then I had, like, when I had my wisdom teeth extracted, I had really curved roots, and so I still have root fragments in my jaw. They're still there. So I remind my husband, like, we can use that for positive ID if needed, because you never know. Or interesting fractures. That can be, there was one case I worked on where the two boys were similar in age. They hadn't been to the dentist yet. They were very young, but the one had broken his leg the year before. And so we were able to use those x-rays to figure out which boy was which to help out there. So when the parents buried them, they were able to bury them with their name and know which boy was which. So it's keeping yourself open to any option you see. An injury that somebody had that might have caused them to walk in a way that others would have noticed was different. So if the police need to do an appeal to say that if anybody has any leads on a neighbor who they haven't seen in a while, who would have walked with a noticeable limp, or, favored an arm, and one arm didn't work, that might be enough for them to go, hey, you know what? I haven't seen that old guy down the street for a while, to help spur on the investigation, to give them some leads. So we'll always look for those little tidbits that are unique to that individual that might help trigger somebody's memory to go, yeah, I remember, yeah, that neighbor. I haven't seen them in a while, and they had this going on. Or activity indicators. This is where, even though we have to know our bones really well, we need to know our muscles, because our muscles attach to the bones. And if you use certain muscles on a regular basis, they get bigger, while the bones have to grow in certain ways to accommodate those more developed muscles. So we might be able to say, well, this person, sprained their ankle a lot and had a lot of ankle instability. That comes in handy, especially with recreating activity in archaeological populations too. And I always think of, again, I'm accident prone. What have I done to myself? And trying to think of how's that going to show up on the skeleton? What might I see in somebody else's skeleton? Or my students will share horror stories of their personal accidents that they've experienced, and bring in pictures and x-rays, and I'll just like, oh my. Especially before I had my son, and now that I've had my son, the male students come in like, oh, I did this and that, and I'm like, oh, what am I in for with my 9-year-old? And trying to think going forward, how is this impacting their skeleton? How might that look? Because again, that might be something that we can use going forward, because again, that variation, we have a lot of weird things that can go on with our bodies. Every skeleton has generally the same basic parts. There's going to be some variation, and then there's going to be some extra quirks. And sometimes if you're not used to seeing those extra quirks, they might be normal developmental things, like holes where you might not expect there to be holes, that might be misinterpreted for healed gunshot wounds, for example. Like there's a hole that sometimes people have on their breastbone. You wouldn't notice it in yourself living, because there would be membrane over it. Or the holes in the back area of the head, usually they're for blood vessels typically. I have seen images of ones that were like, they look like bowling ball holes. They're that big. Most people, they're small. But yeah, you'd see that and go, oh, he must have had cranial surgery. I'm like, no, based on that location, they're just very large parietal foramina. It's normal variation. It's important to know that, because otherwise you would think healed gunshot wound or cranial surgery. No, it's variation. But it's cool stuff that might show up on x-rays or CAT scans.
So do you have any advice, say like I do have some x-rays or some sort of images of, say, like a unique kind of leg bone, right? Do you have any advice as to like how to document that, just in case, like worst case scenario?
Making sure family members are aware of, like, hey, you know what? I've got a third trochanter on my right femur, because that's a developmental quirk.
Tell me, how can high school students begin to learn a little bit more about forensics and really get a better grip on, say, if they want to pursue a forensics career, how should they get started?
Well, one of the things that they can do is just talk with their high school guidance counselors. Had a lot of students through the years tell me that, like, the person who they had the best rapport with in high school was that guidance counselor. I can't say the same, but maybe they're a better breed now nowadays than they were back in the 90s. But and talk to them about doing job shadows, or during the career fairs, there's invariably going to be a police officer or a state trooper, who's there for the career fair, and talk to them and ask, how did you find yourself, in the role that you're in? What can I start doing to put myself in position to have that type of career? Or even just go down to your local police department and talk to the officers there. And it could be that, independent of the school, that you might be able to hang out with them for the day or get a tour of the station and learn a little bit more and pick their brain a bit. A lot of high schools already set up to do tours at their local universities, or even at, say, the medical examiner's office or the coroner's facility. Talk to them and just pick their brains, because it could be that they might come at it from different directions. Talk to multiple individuals, and you might find that especially depending on the area that you're in, it might be really easy to start this conversation and finding schools that you might be interested in going to, or just reaching out to the faculty, or if, depending on the school, there's always a variety of clubs that you could reach out to the clubs at those universities to talk to the students there about what advices to have. And there's so many websites and forums and discussion boards and listservs out there that you can start getting on board with them, with these different interest groups. And you'll find other lay people as well as professionals to chat with in various stages of their careers, to find out how did they get where they are today, and what might you be able to do to reach that same place, or maybe even go further. And so, like, not everybody would be happy doing forensic anthropology on a as needed basis. For example, like, a lot of us teach at universities and then do forensic cases as they come up on the side. Others would rather be doing forensic cases all the time. Or you might see yourself helping more with the military and recovering remains of soldiers who are missing in action. And so there's a different aspect that works for different personalities. So some of the people I went to school with are working with the military to go out to Southeast Asia and living in the jungle and working with nasty insects and eating interesting things. That's not the life for me. I like teaching. I enjoy it. I love working with students. Other of my friends would not be up for that. And I know others who are doing nothing but casework, but I enjoy the education aspect. And it's good to find out, well, what are these different avenues that we can pursue? As an undergrad, I thought I wanted to work at the Smithsonian. and consult with the FBI. I just want to work at the museum. But then I came to realize with all the workshops I helped at that I enjoyed the teaching element. And then as I went on to grad school and was a teaching assistant, again, still growing that teaching aspect. So I'm where I'm content being. And so still getting to consult every now and then, getting to do archaeological work, and the teaching element and helping those students find that path for them. Because it's not a cookie cutter, one path fits all. I've had students going in all sorts of directions. Some are in circles. It helped to straighten them out too, so they're heading in one consistent direction. But it's just talk to people. And if you email them once and you don't hear from them, try again. Give them a while. Maybe they're really busy. But just try again or reach out to someone else. But just throw it out there, because I know I write novels to people when they write me and say, hey, how can I get into forensic anthropology? Even if they don't end up coming to study with me, that's fine. At least I've given them some advice so that they can go forward and figure out what it is that they want to do. But there's a lot of different professionals out there. You can look. Some of them have their membership directories readily available on their websites, or a lot of them will also have information for, having a career in this discipline. So like the American Academy of Forensic Sciences has different pages for the different disciplines they represent. And so they'll already have some helpful advice available for folks there as well.
So one can go to school for forensics, but if you're working in crime scenes, do you also have to be trained by local law enforcement or the police? Maybe like going to a police academy?
Well, you wouldn't have to go into the police academy. So like with the way it's set up with the Pennsylvania State Police, you could go to the State Police Academy to be trained to be a trooper. And many of the troopers will be trained, say, like with the crime scene photography. My dad was an accident reconstruction expert. And so they'll have those basics, but when they need like the people in the lab, those are civilian positions. So it depends on the force that you're interested in affiliating yourself with. That for some, you might have to be a police officer to process. Others might have dedicated crime scene response teams like the FBI has. One of our alumni who did a guest lecture for me, she works for DC Metro Police. She's not an officer. She's a crime scene tech, and she is busy. And so you also have to think then, how busy do you want to be, and the potential risk to yourself, depending on like she said, sometimes it can be a little risky depending on where exactly they're at in DC. I'm sure it's the same in any major metropolitan area. For forensic anthropology, a lot of our bodies are out in the woods, so our biggest concern would be hunters mistaking us for deer. But you have to think of that element. So it really depends on where you see yourself. Do you want to be a police officer too, have the powers of arrest? CSI kind of gave the wrong impression there with their crime scene and their lab people doing suspect interviews, or with bones and bones being involved in interviews. No, we don't do that. If there's something extra we need, we tell the investigating detective or like the medical examiner's office, like, find out this info for us. We're not going to go question the suspects ourselves. So it's a matter of really what element of it you like to see yourself.
What requirements are there for a CSI detective?
Well, and when I used to also advise for the criminal justice students, oftentimes I'd have freshmen saying, I want to be a detective, but I don't want to be a police officer. I said, that's not going to happen. You have to earn your stripes. So you have to start off as a grunt, low level, lowest ranking police officer, and earn your way up.
So the detectives, they have to go to police academy then?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
To the academy, they would have been a cop on the beat, and then either through additional training that they might have done, or just through their hard effort and whatever the promotion strategy is, that department, then you could work yourself up to it. But it's not something straight out of school you're going to slip into that type of position.
Okay. And that's kind of like a ladder that you have to climb yourself. There's not necessarily like, oh, you leave school with a degree and you're instantly qualified.
It, kind of like with some of there, it might help to maybe jump a few steps,
Right.
but still you've got to show that you can do it.
Right.
And they need to be able to see that you can do it. So it might help to speed up the process, but there's still, certain benchmarks that you have to reach in order to be thrown out there, because you can have as much school book classroom training as possible. Same with like skeletal analysis. You've studied all these bones in your little lab, and then you go out into the field. It's like, oh my. You need to be exposed to a lot more to see how these processes work, as well as the nuances of navigating that political climate as well. And so there's politics, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can't just graduate from college and boom, you're a detective. And then some places will have those death investigators. So like my student she's been graduated now in 3-4 years now. She's a certified death investigator. She's not a cop, she's a civilian, but that was additional training that she had to earn. Then I don't know what kind of testing is involved as well to show your content knowledge, but you're going to have to earn your stripes, definitely.
Oh, I'll never forget this. I was hiking up a mountain for to take some photos, like landscape photos, because there's a beautiful reservoir on the top of the mountain. So I'm climbing, I hike up it, and I'm hiking down, and I see this trail of fur, right? And I'm like, oh, I wonder what's at the end of that trail, like what could that be? So then I follow it. I have to like go up over a tree. It was a down tree, and then I find a bone, and I'm like, ooh, I'm getting close. So then I keep going, and I see just the full spinal column laid out. And obviously, in this instance, it was a deer that was attacked and eaten by scavengers or big cats, maybe. I don't know, but possibly. I mean, I think Game Commission says that here in Northeast Pennsylvania there are no mountain lions, but I have seen some Facebook photos of some mountain lions around. Anyway, so what I'm getting at is, do you have any tips, like without visually comparing, so for the listening audience, do you have any tips as to how to tell if a bone is an animal or if it's human?
So, essentially, if you know it's an upper arm bone, it helps if you have some basic, it depends on the parts of the body that you're finding. So say if it's the skull, just think of where's the hole where the spinal cord is exiting the brain. Is it more in the back of the head? Is it directly underneath the head? Does it look like it's shaped anything like your own, essentially? Look at the teeth. The teeth are a really good indicator. Like, even though our teeth are meant more for being omnivores, so processing both plant and meat matter, they don't look what we see in deer. They don't look like sheep, horse, cow, herbivores, versus dog, cat. Most of us will have some experience with our pets or pets of our friends. What do those teeth look like? Do they look anything like what's in your mouth? If yes, then perhaps it's human. I mean, I still have students who will send me photographs and say, did I come across a human? Should I call the police? And invariably, most of the cases we get asked about, it's non-human. So most of the time it won't be human. But if it's a long bone, and most of the long bones will start off in multiple parts. This is true for any other mammal. If it looks like it's got all its parts and none of the ends look like English muffin texture, then probably the ends of the bones are fused on there. If it looks really huge, it's probably not human. If it looks really tiny, probably not human. Where we can get thrown off are with child remains, because their bones can look really odd, especially really young ones. So If somebody's chihuahua was wearing a sweater, ran off into the woods and died, and you come across this very small skeleton with this very bulbous head, if the muzzle isn't there and you don't see those teeth, you might think at first, oh my God, it's a dead baby. It's in a sweater. That can throw people off. But then you could see where the neck attaches towards the back of the head. And so for us, we have a short and broad pelvis. Other animals, other mammals like quadrupeds, your dogs, cats, cows, they're elongated, they're stretched out. So if it's, ours is often described as being cup-like or bowl-like. If you are dealing with feet, do you see claws? Do you see hooves? Because they might preserve. Are foot bones, do you have enough there for 5 toes? Does it look like one of them is going to be much bigger compared to the others? Our big toe, those bones are much thicker compared to the other ones. Or looking at the hand bones, again, are there claws? Does it look like there's a short little thumb-like appendage on them? Now, some other animals will have, think of squirrels, they can have that as well, but thinking of the size of it, again, if it looks like all the little pieces for it are fused together, but it looks like it might be squirrel size, then it might be a squirrel. But more often than not, what will be confused with human around here in Pennsylvania is usually deer, on occasion bear. If you're in farm area, it might be sheep, goat. But yeah, the bulk of the forensic anthropology cases are not human. So more than likely what you encountered was not human. But I'm always looking. Every time I'm out hunting, I don't hunt, hiking, I'm always looking for, that looks like a good place to stash a body. Is there one? Or if I smell something rotting, I'm like, I gotta go look to see if it's human. But yeah, most of the time it won't be. The teeth are one of the easiest things. If you hunt, you already have a basic feel, more than likely, of some of the non-human skeletal anatomy, especially if you process your own game. So you can go with kind of your gut there. People who grow up on farms are used to seeing dead things. They're, dead critters, wherever you haul off the carcass. They'll generally have a working appreciation for what might be human. But otherwise, if you just think of your typical Halloween skeleton, or the basic shape of the bones that we have, if it looks like an upper arm bone, the humerus, there's going to be telltale features that you can still, even if you've never seen a cat skeleton and I plunk one in front of you and you know what a human humerus looks like, you can pick out the cat one. There'll be hallmarks of the bones that match up across mammal species. It gets a little squirrely with marine mammals, but if we're looking at terrestrial mammals, there's going to be features that can help us to figure out what bone it is, even if you're not used to dealing with that skeleton. But there's a lot of resources out there. If you're out hiking, you can quickly always go-to's deer. More than anything else, that's what I've had to tell people, it's deer. Just, look up deer bones, and there's going to be tons of pictures online that you can quickly make a comparison with what you're seeing there to help you with, should I call the cops? Do I need to mark this spot and hike back to where I get reception? But yeah, if you do a quick look online, it helps a lot. Or if you need to take pictures, make sure you put something there for scale, because depending on the way you take a photograph, I'm like, oh, what am I looking at? Okay, I need something for scale here. That'll help out if they need to make a quick assessment on whether or not they need to return to that scene where you were just hiking. But yeah, it's amazing what's out there online that can help you with that.
Oh yeah, I was watching a forensic anthropology talk, and it was funny because the speaker, she was saying how she gets calls all the time from police sending her photos of what look like mummified hands, but they're actually seal flippers washing up on shore. And the cop is like, oh, okay, cool. I'll just throw it back in the ocean. She's like, no, because it'll get re-washed up on shore, and she'll get the same call, same everything.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say bear paws because that's usually
Oh,
what you'll get here in PA, especially people have been poaching and they
oh,
want claws and they chop off the claws and they ditch the rest of the paw. Um, Especially if it's young bear, people are like, oh my God, it's human. What we'll see on like the heads of the metacarpals, it's not a smooth dome, it has a ridge in the center. So that helps. There's other features too, but that's the easiest one. But yeah, for us here in Pennsylvania, thinking it's a hand or a foot, it's probably bear. But steel flippers, yeah, I guess if you're on the coast, that
yep.
would be wrong.
There's this trend on TikTok, right? It's like, oh, is it? Here's how to tell if it's a stone or if it's a bone. And all these kids, right? They go and they get the stone and they lick it. And apparently, if it's a stone, it's gonna fall. But if it's a bone, it's gonna stick to your tongue.
Yeah, I
Don't do
wouldn't
that at home,
recommend
kids.
that. You don't know where that's been, what's grown
Yeah.
on.
Oh no.
But it makes me think of Neil Haskell, who's a forensic entomologist. He's like, is it a fly puparium or mouse feces? He's like, put it in your mouth. If it melts, it was mouse feces. I'm like, oh. Yeah, it's generally the texture. You're
Right.
going to know the feel of it. And that, again, is where it comes in handy, having handled a lot of material. Because like with the human versus non-human, when the bones are intact, it's easy to tell if it's human or not. But when you're dealing with fragments, it can get harder. And my students will be like, oh my God, they watch me going through stuff. And sometimes I'm not even looking at it. I just touch it because there's a textural and a weight difference that I'm like, that's not human. Um, and that's just from handling thousands of bone fragments over the years because I've done a lot of faunal analysis too. So it's like you just pick up on that feel. But then if things are burnt, that ups the challenge even more because if it's been burned to where it's calcined or whitened, it's down to just the mineral, and so the texture changes. And as bone burns, it shrinks and it warps, and so it makes it even more challenging to figure out what are you looking at. And if it was a structural fire and you have everything, like everything in this room, if it were to burn up with me, how it sticks to the bone or what it looks like when it's burned can make it really challenging. I like that. That sounds awful. It's an interesting challenge to work on, but you can still do so much with it too. But it's again, it's what have you been exposed to? What else have you worked on to be able to make those distinctions? It's just many hours in the lab, many hours.
Are there any quick resources that people can go and either watch or download to really get just the basic understanding of bones and osteology?
One of the books that I use a lot for my students is called The Human Bone Manual. It's by Tim White, and that's a great reference. Fabulous photos. They're black and white photos, but to show you every aspect of a bone and identifying features, what they're typically confused with. Um, and when you're out hiking, look for things. There's so many bones out there, just out there in the woods that you can look at and start to see what does that look like and what this environment does to the bone, whether it's been submerged in water or if it's been exposed to bright sun constantly, or has it been burned, and just look at a lot of things. Go to museums, whatever might be open around you, and see what they have on exhibit and look at. And volunteer opportunities. That's another key thing. If you have folks who are interested in doing work with skeletal material, see what museums are nearby, what kind of collections they have, and what their volunteer opportunities are. Because it isn't just volunteering in the exhibits themselves, but you might be able to volunteer with all the stuff that isn't on exhibit and to help the curators and collections managers in making order of the collections they have. So many museums have so much work that needs to be done and not enough staffing. And they're trying to bring their collections management up to the 21st century, because some are still operating in the 19th century. And so they need help. And if you're willing to volunteer, who knows what you'll get to see, because really all the cool stuff is in storage. It's not on exhibit. That's just a fraction of what they have, what's on exhibit. So volunteer. The stuff I got to see when I did my dissertation research in London at the Natural History Museum there, it was so cool walking through the stacks of just all this history and the fossils and things that you got to see that who knows if anyone else would ever get to see them, if they'd ever go on exhibit. So, if you can get some help in there, or even just working with the local historical societies too, who knows what they have in their collections. And that's another way to maybe see a different aspect of what you'd be able to do.
What's your take on forensic research facilities, aka body farms?
We need them, and we need more of them. Because we have our climactic differences, and that's one of the big things that these body farms help us with, is understanding what factors influence how quickly a body's going to decompose. And when you're working with different bodies, if you have a very overweight individual versus a skinny little person, how quickly are they going to decompose? That's going to throw off our ability to figure out time since death. And that's one of the things where I tell my students, where it's kind of an art, being able to figure out how long's it been when we are dealing with just strips of flesh, decomposition fluid, and odor with our bone. And having these facilities where we can control as many variables as we can, going from a known of what the person had looked like the day they were received versus the setting you put them in, and being able to observe them over time, it's critical. One of the things that we've seen for forensic science lately is, it's been under the microscope on our ability to be accurate, to measure our error, to be consistent and reliable. And I tell my students that for forensic anthropology, where we're going to catch the most flack is our ability to determine time since death, and our interpretation of trauma events, not just that it's sharp force trauma, but what position was the body in, and what were they doing at the time they received that trauma. And so we need people in different these body farms, we need them in different settings. Because the first one down in Tennessee, Knoxville, it's a very different environment, hotter summers, not as cold winters compared to us here in Pennsylvania. So they're going to see a different decomp rate. One of my students is now working on her master's at Texas State in San Marcos, and they have a facility there. And so you figure Texas, it's hot. And so they're going to break down, it's going to decompose so much more quickly than it would here. There's one that's in Colorado. The one in Boston, I'm not sure if they've been able to sustain it, because there was a lot of flack that they received about that. But we need more. And again, to help us to better understand what's going on. Otherwise, we're just learning it through the cases that we work on, and our experience level versus those more controlled, regulated experiments, if you will. Because otherwise, we deserve to be questioned more difficultly on the stand regarding that, because that can make or break somebody's alibi, especially if we're looking at a year or close to a year out. One of the cases I worked on, they didn't have me in the field, they only had me analyze the remains in the lab. And they wanted me to provide them with a post-mortem interval. And I said, well, it's going to be severely limited, because I have no knowledge on the setting this body came from, other than the person had been outside. But I don't know the amount of vegetation, sun exposure, water that might flush through the area. So I need more to be able to do more for you, and more controlled situations we can have, the better. And we had thought about having one at our university. We actually had an agreement for access to land almost an hour away from the school, but that got axed. It's been put on the shelf. I don't know if that'll ever happen. People think it's fascinating, but they don't want it anywhere near them. So you need a more rural area to be able to do this. And so I like the DCNR has a predator cam. So I'll often watch that. They'll stake out deer, and it has a camera that'll take pictures when something's there to see who's coming in and scavenging on those remains, and think of what damage are they doing to the bone that could mimic trauma from a weapon, or how it might cover up the trauma that we might see. That's pretty cool research. I'd love to get a hand on those bones. Like I might recommend that for a student for grad school work down the road, like work with the Department of Natural Resources and their predator cam setups. But we need more of those facilities. We're fortunate in the US. We have sort of led the way in forensic anthropology. Most other forensic sciences started outside the US. This is one of the ones where it has really grown in the US, and it's mainly because of our tie with the military and not wanting to leave any soldier behind. And so that has really pushed our ability to identify people from their skeletal remains. So we are more open towards that type of research to help with that identification. But the idea of decomposing bodies out at a facility grosses out a lot of people, maybe intrigues some people, maybe a little too much. But I know there's a strong interest, because when I probably get about 5 or 6 inquiries a year, people saying that they're interested in donating their body for scientific research. They'd like to go to a facility where they can become one with nature. And so I'll let them know, well, we don't have that capability right now, but here are some other places to consider. So there's interest, whether it's school teachers wanting to be able to teach beyond the grave, or I had one gentleman who was in the prison system and had been there for some time, and he said, I've already been too much of a burden to my family in the state. I want to give something back, and if this is the way I can do it, this is how I want to do it. And so I've let him know about body donation process. But we need more, and we need more in different settings around the world. And because too many places try to make use of the research here, I'm like, well, it works here, but it might not work in your country, so we need something more where you are. And it's getting there. It's just winning people over and having secure facilities and continuing on research.
What would you say is the number one factor, or I guess maybe the top 5 factors, or however many, that are preventing more body farms from popping up?
Health reasons, concerns about spread of disease, kind of hearkening back to centuries ago, where people associated bad odors with disease. Like malaria is mal-area, bad air, foul smells lead to disease. That's why the Brits ended up closing cemeteries in London, or burials within the churches, because they were afraid if you're smelling these bodies decomposing within the structure, you're going to get sick. Well, you might throw up, but you won't get an infectious disease. But they're concerned, well, if that person had a disease, then it's going to get in our drinking water, it's going to get in the soil, and so there's that concern. Or just some folks don't want to see the dead being treated that way. They think it's disrespectful, even if the person themselves chose to be donated to science for this purpose. The neighbors might disagree because it goes against their ideology, and they don't want the body to be treated that way. So it's just, in this day and age where a lot of people seem to be anti-science, it might be a bit hard to win them over to the fact that we're not accepting plague victims. Like the disease risk to ourselves working on decomposing bodies is mainly from whatever bacteria, mold might grow on the body, but the person, whatever they might have had, isn't a risk factor for us as they're decomposing. So that risk is minimal. And deer die in the drinking water supply systems anyway, and like, you're fine. That's why we have filtration systems and water treatment plants. If they learned out where the blood went from the funeral home next door, they'd probably freak out. I think it's the visual. Too many horror films, and people just think it's nasty. And it's just if they learn more about the process and the rationale for it, and appreciate the fact that a lot of people want to donate their body to go this way. It's just like the difficulties we have on winning folks over to have the more natural green cemeteries. Like we have one in Verona. I don't know if that's near Pittsburgh here. How much of a fight did they have to get that set up? And so it's just education, educating people, them being open to something other than the standard traditional way that they've been raised to think this is what we should be doing with the dead. But we need more opportunity for research. And oftentimes the bodies, after they've decomposed, if the family members want them back, they'll get them. If they want them cremated, they'll get cremated. Many times they'll donate them to that university that the facility is affiliated with, which we need more of, because a lot of the skeletal collections that are being used for research are based off of individuals who died in the early 20th century. And skeletons aren't fixed. Like they'll change with environmental conditions, your diet, your health. There'll be changes. Stature and the way that we calculate how tall someone is. Lifestyle changes are going to impact how quickly the bones break down with aging. The fact that puberty hits a lot earlier now than it used to. I always embarrass my students to talk about menstruation, heaven forbid. And what impact is that going to have on growth attainment, how soon the ends of bones are going to fuse together, especially for females. That could throw off our age estimation. Dietary changes in teeth and tooth development. I was like, we need to work on more modern populations for forensic standards, and we need more representation of the diverse population of the United States, because most of our comparative collections are either of European Americans or African Americans, and there's more to the US than that. And so we can't just blindly take a technique that was developed on one group and hope that it's going to be accurate on another without it being tested. And so we need a lot more testing. Or other countries might use standards that were developed here on their population. I'm like, it's not necessarily going to be accurate for them, and we need to get a handle on that as well. So I encourage my students to pursue more with looking at medical imaging. But we need, because it sounds awful, okay? In the 19th century, biological anthropologists, term lightly applied, had no qualms with going, "Ooh, that person has a cool skull. When they're dead, I'm just going to take it." Nowadays, we don't do that. But it'd be fantastic if we could get a CAT scan, and with 3D printing available. I would love a copy of my own skull. That would be cool.
Yeah.
But then that's another way that we can create expanded opportunities for research. If we can CAT scan living people and make 3D hard copies, and then also work with more of the images that you can actually do measurements on the computer accurately, that will help us to expand our available reference material for developing new techniques, or testing out to see if an existing technique works on a different population. But that's going to be expensive. But I think that's where we need to go, and because otherwise we are left with a convenient sample. We deal with whatever dead we have our hands on, right? But if we want to be able to get a more representative sample, then we need to start getting more images of living individuals. And again, that's going to be expensive, but I think that's where the future needs to go for us to have more to work with to improve our forensic techniques.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that sounds really good for the future. Are there any other kind of maybe trends like that, or what can we expect in future developments, like the evolution of forensic science in the future?
Better accuracy, maybe quicker results in some techniques. One of the big things with what we do skeletally, we're very limited on what we can do with remains of children. Part of that is due to the fact that we don't have a lot of forensic-related child material to work with. Again, this is where the CAT scans could really help us, because otherwise we're testing a lot on documented skeletal collections, like the one I used for my dissertation dates to the 1700s to early 1800s. Can you apply those to kids of the 21st century? Not necessarily. So oftentimes when we're just looking at naked bone, we can age them. We can age them. You want to know what sex that individual is? You'll have to do DNA testing. Child skeletons are changing so much that maybe dentally we can get some indicators on ancestry of the individual, but otherwise you can't really rely on the craniofacial indicators that we look for. And then also, we look at ancestry and where did your people come from geographically, and what physical features have been affiliated with that general area. But with breakdown of social barriers and geographical barriers, you can have babies with whomever you want. And so we see blending of features. And so ancestry estimation is one of those things that feels kind of taboo, but the police still expect, is this someone African American or of European descent? We don't have a good enough gauge on admixture, because there's no clear formula of if your father was this and your mother was this, or your grandfather was that and your grandmother was this, what physical features will you have? Just because your bones look one way, it also doesn't control like what your skin will look like, your hair texture, how you self-identify. And so that's another area where we face a lot of challenge, where eventually I think stopped even trying, especially as gene flow continues and features that we look for become much more common, that's something that we might see disappear from the biological profile that we determine. Because it's when you had an isolated population from 500 years ago, that's pretty easy. Modern population where people can travel all around the world, as long as it's not a closed group that only marries and has children amongst the closed group, you don't know what you're going to see skeletally. And I think that's probably going to be one of the things that we'll just stop trying to do. There's been a lot of discussion, and this is something that I talk about with my students and we read about a lot in books, on getting better with adult age estimation. Because when you watch Bones, she'll be like, oh, that guy is 30 to 34 years old. We wish we could be that specific. Pretty much once you hit 30, things start breaking down. And that's what we're looking at, is breakdown of surfaces. And depending on your lifestyle, your diet, your genetics, some people will break down a lot more quicker than others. And so I don't think we'll ever be that specific, but darn it, they're going to keep trying. They want to make it really tight. And I tell my students I'm optimistic about so many other things, but our ability to be very specific for estimating the age of adults. So one of the things we should be able to do a better job of, this makes me feel old because I'm 45. The way we categorize adults, we have young adults, middle adults, and older adults, and our older adults are people over 50. I should hope my skeleton will look hopefully a bit better than my 99-year-old grandmother's. So hopefully we'll be able to do a better job with older adults. But then we also need to do more research on the implication of, when you think of opioid addiction, like it's bad here in southwestern PA, what impact does that have on the bone? And might that cause it to break down more quickly? Will somebody who's an addict and who's been a chronic addict, will that age their bones more quickly? And someone's starting to look into that, but that's a relatively more recent inquiry, so it'll be interesting to see. There's literature out there that shows that if someone's a chronic alcoholic, that it does have an impact on their bones. And so that's something else that we need to look into more as well, because that'll be another dimension that we can add to the profile that we provide to the death investigators about the individual.
what are some clear signs of, say, like an older skull? From my understanding, it's the sutures on the skull itself kind of start to begin to fuse together.
Sometimes. The cranial sutures can be highly variable. That, like, I have one individual that I have analyzed in my lab whose sutures were completely wide open. Even on the inside of the skull, and that's usually where they'll fuse first. If you were just looking at the sutures, you would say, oh, that has to be a very young adult. But the texture of the bone, because I just pick it up, I'm like, that's an old person. Barring disease, older individuals will have thinner bone. It'll feel lighter. Oftentimes in many areas, it'll have a lot more lumps, bumps, and a holy texture as surfaces break down. We'll get parietal thinning on the skull. And essentially, you kind of get a feeling that the bones are just weary. Sometimes, I swear, some of them, they just feel like they've seen things. When we're looking at joint surfaces, generally they'll have a lot more holes, bony protrusions. When you think of arthritis, typically much more pronounced in older individuals. Again, as I tell my students, if the bone looks really ugly, barring disease or injury, it's probably an older person. So just full of holes and irregularities. If it's a surface that's usually kind of oval or rounded and now it's kind of scalloped along the edges and craggy, probably an older person, again, barring disease or injury. And the suture, sometimes if somebody genetically might have fusion earlier, and then that usually results in a bizarrely shaped skull that people will notice. Nowadays, if you have that happen, they'll intervene and have surgery. If they catch on that a baby skull's fusing too early, they'll step in, here in the United States at least. If you have an injury, you fell and you hit your head, or you broke a bone and it crosses the growth plate, that might cause it to fuse too early. And that'll also impact the way that bone will grow. So again, here in the US, typically you'll seek medical intervention and they'll keep an eye on that, so that if you broke that bone, that you'll still be able to see it grow properly, or they can intervene sooner than perhaps with surgery to make sure that the length will be okay in the long run. But yeah, when I think of my 99-year-old grandmother versus my bones, hoping that I'll do a better job. Like, we don't do a lot of density scans on forensic material, but we could look at that too. Also with the spongy bone, it looks like a sponge or cake. It looks like cake. It's firm, but it looks that way. That will become more sparse in older individuals as the body's aging. And so those are things that we can start looking for to help push us towards an older person. But if we have someone who had early onset menopause and a lot of hormonal irregularity, or I'll get a lot of questions about people getting hormone therapies to transition and what impact might that have on the bone. And that is something where we need more research. And that's a population that would be potentially hard to get people willing to say, hey, can you go get regular CAT scans or density scans as you continue on with your transition from male to female or female to male, so that we can get a grasp, because as more people undergo these transitions, it increases their frequency of potentially ending up in the forensic population, with the number of hate crimes targeted towards people who just don't conform with somebody else's perception of what's normal. There's a higher chance of them ending up in our lab to be analyzed. And so our ability to do a better job of understanding their life history, we need a better grasp on the changes that happen to their bodies too. But what kind of follow-up procedures or imaging is done in those situations, that's something I don't know. And that's something that we need to look at from a forensic perspective. But again, it's I think a challenging topic. How do you broach that with someone who's already going through a major change in their life? But that's just something we need to be mindful of going forward. And that's where, if there are associated artifacts personal effects with the body that might help to suggest our bones might be saying one thing, but it looks like personal effects wise are saying something else. That's a dimension you'd mention to the police to say, hey, as you're making your inquiries, keep a mind open towards this, that this might be what we're seeing here, somebody who's transitioning. So we have our challenges. Forensic anthropology as a recognized discipline is a little older than me. And I like to say it's not that old. So it's a relatively young forensic profession. And we got our basics, and now we have a lot more areas to get into to improve what we're able to do. And so we always have to constantly think of, where do we go next? What else can we do next? How can we make this better? And that's one of the things I like working with undergrads, to help them look at what are our future paths that we can take. What can they do in the future to help improve the discipline and to keep it going strong and going forward and doing a better job.
Because you work with bones all the time, do you have any tips of how to make your bones stronger? Does milk really make bones strong, or is that just a capitalistic lie?
You need the calcium. You definitely need the calcium. We actually have an issue with rickets and osteomalacia in our Western world these days, because we're so concerned about skin cancer enough that when we are outside, we're wearing too much sunscreen. We don't get any of the exposure to the sun for our bodies to make our own vitamin D that we need for healthy bone, or the kids aren't going outside enough and they're not eating right. So yeah, having that proper diet and exercise, because bone, if it's not being stimulated, will thin out. Like wherever we don't need it, it will thin out and it'll be potentially weaker. You were talking about being shut-ins, and this time,
Yep.
like with the COVID-19, we're all staying at home. I'm not going outside as much as I would during my normal life. I try to go for at least a 2-mile walk a day, but if I'm not eating right, and I don't eat the best, and if I'm not being exposed to the sun, then I'm not getting the vitamin D production that I need. And if that becomes a chronic problem, then my bones can become weaker, and you can suffer pathological fractures under areas of increased stress. So you might suddenly experience a pelvic fracture just from sitting on your butt because you didn't have enough vitamin D. But that's more of a chronic. It's not going to be like after just a couple weeks, depending on how you eat and your overall health. It could be with a few months. So this shutdown time can potentially have some, long-term effects on people's health if they're not being careful. And worry about the elderly, because they're being extra careful right now to make sure that they're not being exposed to COVID-19. But, we need to make sure that they're getting all the vitamins and nutrients that they need in order to maintain their health and to keep it strong. So, the bones, they put up a good fight, but after a while, they too will show, the effects of poor diet and lack of exercise.
So, as we wrap up the conversation, is there anything you want to specifically talk on or mention?
I suppose one of the big things is to keep an open mind, whether it's about, the study of death, or interacting with folks of different cultures, or even just different beliefs compared to your own. Because the fact that, I work with dead things, oh my goodness, how often I'll be told, well, you seem like such a nice person, but you deal with dead things. Like, what's wrong with you? That this world needs all types of people of all different interests in order to keep it going. So especially with a lot of the contention that we see in our society today, is just approaching things with an open mind, and the fact that we don't have to agree on everything, but to have the opportunity to hear their point of view, whether it's regarding how they want their remains to be treated in death. Or for me, I want to do research on bones. Other people don't want us doing research on bones. I'm like, that's fine, different cultural beliefs, and respecting that. And that's something that you can't be taught in schools, common sense and respect. And we need more of that in society today. So just to take a moment to think about things and to become educated about things before spouting out about it. Or if you need to vent first, have a private moment to do that, and then think of a more polite way to have an interaction with another person. It's kind of disheartening to see some of the hate and vitriol out there in the world right now, when we should be coming together to help pull through and find ways to help the folks who really need help, or to help keep people well. And to, sometimes we might need to make small personal sacrifices in order to achieve betterment of society as a whole. So there's a reason why myself and a lot of my students prefer working with the dead, because they give you a heck of a lot less lip and difficulty with things. You can hold a conversation with them, very one-sided. They're not very forthcoming all the time.
So tell us where we can learn more about you, and if anyone has any questions for you, where could they reach you?
Well, you can find me on the CalU website. So their web address is just www.calu.edu. And you can search for me in the directory, or just in the search bar. Just Kuba will do it. I'm the only one there, so just Kuba, and you'll find me. And the university's been restructuring, so I'm in a new department, so the website hasn't been updated yet, so I'm not even sure where they say I am. I'm now working more closely with the biology department, so but if you search for me on the website, you'll see my usual blurb I have up there about what I've done, my CV, my qualifications. But they're always welcome to send me an email, and that's at kuba@calu.edu. So just Kuba at calu.edu, and they can send me an email, and I'll be happy to respond. In the summer months, I check my email maybe about once a week, I'll be honest. But during the school year, I'm on it constantly. So they're, depending on where we're at with the COVID-19 stuff, email is probably the best way to reach out. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. But not only that, thank you for inspiring students in TV shows, for helping catch bad guys, and pushing for the advancement of forensic science, which is much needed. For all that, thank you so much.
Thank you. And stay well.
Thank you. You too. Thank you for watching the Death Science Podcast. For updates and new episodes, subscribe right now. It's quick at deathscience.org. Remember that we all must die one day, so talk to your loved ones now about your post-life plans for your body. Learn more about creative and beneficial post-life plans at restinggrounds.org. I'm your host, Jeremy, signing off of another episode. Thank you, and memento mori.